So everyone, I see the attendance starts to drop a little bit. This is like the fifth session. It's been a marathon, 5 hours. I'm starting to feel it a little bit, but that's okay. Conversation with Andrea is going to be fantastic. So let me tell you about her. Dr. Andrea Limbago is a computational social scientist and technology executive specializing in the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. She is currently the chief social scientist at Virtue, where she integrates her research on privacy, cybersecurity, and geopolitics to advocate for the essential role of security and privacy for innovation, democracy, and internet freedoms. Wow. She's also an ex-soccer player, which is really, really good.
Always a soccer player, right?
And I had the honor of welcoming Andrea to the International CISO Summit that we had in September in Cartagena. And it was really, really good session. Her session today is about global factors driving data protection, regulation, and privacy is one of the main topics that everyone is discussing lately. So Andrea, welcome. Welcome.
No, thanks for having me here.
Yeah, this is great. So let's start with something I mentioned this yesterday during our test. A friend of mine that I do a podcast with in Latin America, Andrea Almanza, he said to me a couple of weeks ago that privacy has to deal with use, security has to deal with access. Do you agree with that statement? What do you think? Is that a differentiator between privacy and security?
Yeah, so I don't think it's an exact differentiator, and I'll explain why. So on the one hand, there is sort of this false dichotomy that we think of security is on one side, privacy is on the other, and that there's no overlap between them. And so there are lots in common. There also are some differences, but as far as access and use, I look at it more so access is, you can think about as ways as who you want to have access to. So with privacy, it's really about gaining control over who can see your data. It's not about hoarding it all, keeping it locked down and siloed and so forth. It's selectively being able to reveal which data you want and for what purpose. And so I sort of look at those, access and use as sort of necessary conditions, not just sufficient conditions on their own. And for a good example, if you think about like genetic research, so some of us may not want to be sharing any of our genetic information for a variety of reasons. But say you do happen to have a rare disease, maybe you do want to share that data but you only want to share it with certain researchers and not with, say, your employer. And so you want to be able to decide both what kind of data they can see and then who has access to it. And so that's how you can think about, and the who largely can depend on what you think they're going to be doing with that data. So if you think researchers will be using your genetic data to help solve a rare condition or to help support other kinds of research and innovation, you may opt out of having that privacy for that specific group, but you may not want your employer to have access to that same data. And so when you think about access and use, it really is, it's almost a two-step thought process as far as who can access it and what do you think they'll be using it for. And so that's why I think both of those actually fall into the realm of privacy decisions that are made, whereas a lot of security really does, historically security has been more the technical field and privacy has been more the legal field. And where we really are seeing the overlap is in the area of unauthorized data access. And okay. I think, and we're talking about Equifax, right, is the one on top of everyone's mind right now, because that both was a security breach and a big privacy breach. And yes. Because it was unauthorized data access.
Yes, so let's go into that one because that was the pivot point. Your conversation centers around legal, right? Legal laws, international, around privacy. So even though Equifax was affected states, it seems like it also affected some European citizens, if my understanding is correct. So let's start with the legal aspects of that. Is Equifax liable prior to this thing about being a China state? Is Equifax legally liable?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting, and I'll throw in the caveat that I'm not a lawyer and not a practicing lawyer, so this is my policy area and my policy perspective on it. So in the United States, it's changing quite a bit, and so unlike GDPR, which is already fully enacted, and then you've got the CCPA in California, those both include areas for having some sort of baseline reasonable security measures in place. And so those kind of laws did not apply to Equifax at the time. And even now, as we're seeing it, Equifax is one of the many breaches that actually helped basically like build a social movement that we're seeing in the United States in favor of some sort of data protection regulation. And so there's more going on. There at a time, of Equifax, where you started seeing a lot of, like public opinion pressure imposed on the executives for something to be done to them. Some of the distrust, and that's where we start seeing some of the states also starting to put some privacy legislation absent the federal legislation. And so there's the public opinion demand is growing stronger and stronger for something to be done because there were all these breaches and nothing was happening. And in fact, like many of the executives that then eventually stepped down due to public pressure got enormous parachutes as they left. And so that, not necessarily something that goes over quite well for everyone who had their data stolen, and seeing basically little repercussions for someone who made tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for stepping down.
Are you involved directly in writing that type of policy with the legal implications attached to it?
What was the first part of what you said?
I said, are you directly involved in creating policies with the legal implications, or are you helping, or are you part of the group?
No. I mean, well, I'm so I work with and collaborate with people who are working on advising and putting forth paper, research proposals. And so, at the end of the day, it's basically, it's our elected officials who have to decide. And so we can advise as much as we like. And, and that's part of going to the conferences and so forth, is actually also helping the private sector gain the knowledge so they can advise as well. Because what we really need to have is to have, the private sector also involved in the discussions, so that when the US does push forth these data protection policies, that they are something that both can be implemented and also have the intended effect. Because so often we see our government go forth on the technical front and try and, even if their intent is good, it may misfire and have unintended consequences. And so the more, us in the security and privacy community can help inform and engage in executives at various corporations in the private sector, and the private sector can then collaborate and help shape some of these policies, I think the better off we are to make it a holistic approach, because we really do need to have more than just the feedback coming from the government on how to shape it. And so that's one thing I also do, is trying to help bridge the gap between the private and public sectors.
You mentioned that the U.S. privacy policy coming up. How close is the U.S.?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question.
Okay.
We're closer than we were, which isn't saying much. And so just at the end of last year, there were dueling federal privacy policies from the Republicans and the Democrats. And so on the one hand, that's a good sign, because it actually shows an area where we're seeing some bipartisan agreement, which never happens these days. And there are areas where they are very different, and that's okay, because at least we can have that discussion then. So that's a good sign. Where I get really pessimistic, though, is that for years now, we've been seeing any kind of security and privacy legislation basically go to Congress and die. And so we're just not seeing a lot push through. So even things that pass through the House, then will die in the Senate. And so I'm not optimistic about anything getting done in this realm prior to the 2020 election. However, but that said, and so we've got this background drop of basically the state legislatures know that the federal legislation probably isn't going to advance before the election. They're getting a ton of pressure from their own representatives and the citizens in their states. And so the state capitals are the ones pushing forth legislation. So it's not just California. And that's the one thing that I think if we had a big takeaway for those in the United States, it's not just California. And so if you're starting to think about crafting your privacy and your security policies and strategies, really look broader than just California. California is the tip of the iceberg right now. And you've got, Nevada's already passed one, Nebraska just proposed a new law, Massachusetts, New York, Texas, Florida. I think last year, I was watching one hearing where one of the trade associations said that there were over 90 different proposals for data protection at the state capitals last year.
Wow.
So it's really, and on the one hand, you can look at how the GDPR did it, and while not everyone's 100% happy with it, and I'm assuming it will continue to evolve, at least it helped harmonize across the different states for one coherent policy. And then in the US, what I think might happen is we might see a lot of really great innovation going on at the state capitals that will in turn hopefully help inform what a federal privacy law will be. But at the same time, it also will encourage it, because honestly, as from the private sector, dealing with, the variations on how you deal with opting in versus opting out, how you deal with the right to delete, right to access, what's your breach time, like the list goes on and on and on. And if it's different for every single state, it becomes very, very hard to comply with that.
Yeah, because how do you do it? As you said in your description of your conversation this conversation is the data is stored in multiple locations worldwide.
Right.
How are you going to apply that? Different. My data is here. My data is there. The protections.
Right, and actually, and that even gets to the. So that what I just discussed was sort of the complexity going on in the United States. That ignores everything else going on. So across the globe, we're seeing the data localization, right? And so we're seeing increasingly countries are requiring local data storage within their borders. And so what happens with those data localization policies, on the one hand, it may not be as concerning. So Canada has some of these laws. We're probably not as concerned what Canada may do with that data as we are with some of China's laws, some of Russia's laws. Thailand, Vietnam are starting to do the same kind of laws as far as requiring it. And for many of them, they're not only requiring local storage, but also local access to that data in case it's requested.
Oh my goodness.
So basically what we're seeing is this broader use of the legal system to enable government mandated data access. And so that gets very disconcerting to me, especially it almost goes to me, it goes hand in hand with the encryption debate that's going on across the globe. That we can secure data, but we also want to have some government mandated access to it. And so we're seeing that even in India. So you've got the biggest democracy right now is taking some steps to potentially weaken encryption, and that'll have global ramifications.
But talking about the encryption and from the state's perspective, government perspective, it doesn't help with the story that broke out that the U.S. owns the company that does encryption, and we were spying on everyone that used those systems. So it doesn't help.
No, but I mean, so it's interesting. It doesn't help by any stretch of the imagination. It helps explain why we're so distrustful of Huawei, on top of many other reasons, though, right? But it highlights why the U.S. government is so concerned about backdoors into foreign technology. But then it just also highlights very much so that there's the hypocrisy of it that can go on. And on the one hand, we got some great data for us. I'm not, it was during the Cold War, and
that's why we're here. It helped us.
Yeah, it helped. But again, but also it helped for a broader national security reason, and it was within the U.S. owned corporation, which doesn't rationalize on the privacy front. But if you're on the United States, at least the debate against encryption is the national security debate, and we need to weaken encryption to enable so we don't go dark in certain areas and we have access. That argument doesn't stand the test of time whereas that approach may have worked in the Cold War when it was our own products and helping support it. It really doesn't work in the modern age on a broader system when we've got all these different encryption technologies that are out there. So even if we were to weaken encryption in the United States, it doesn't mean that other companies and other countries around the world, they still have access to encryption, and we're going to lose any kind of the metadata that's provided. I mean, I think what gets lost a lot in the Apple and Pensacola and Apple and FBI is how much data they did provide to the FBI along those lines, and really gave. I mean, in the Pensacola case, they didn't want access to they didn't want to have access to encrypted data and for a month after it happened. So they had well over a month's worth of data they were looking through, and Apple provided a ton. And so imagine that if we go into an area where there's, we require backdoors now in US technology, that's going to push the criminals to different markets. And we know this, and there already are black markets right now for encrypted software. And so
I see what you're saying. Okay.
So you see drug cartels, you see criminal groups already creating encrypted mobile devices and softwares that will not be Apple or Google or whichever US company you choose. And so we're going to lose not only the access to the data, the metadata that you might get off an Android or an Apple iPhone, but you're going to go completely dark from all of that.
From an intelligence perspective. From
an intelligence perspective. And so, you can't, it's honestly, it's almost similar to some of the regulations on, on AI. Like, the math is out there. We can't regulate math. We can't just stop math from existing anymore. The genie is out of the bottle. So encryption will exist whether or not we require a backdoor, and the bad guys will use it. And at the end of the day, it will weaken us against a lot of these attacks that we're seeing from China and Russia and criminal groups, Iran, North Korea. I mean, the list actually is it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger for the threat landscape. And that doesn't even get into like some of the counterintelligence issues as well. So it really, the way I look at it, there's just a big demand on the sort of the adversary side for gaining as much data as possible. On the defender side, it's becoming harder and harder to protect it. And encryption is one of the core ways to actually protect the data. It's not the only one, but it should be part of a holistic strategy. And especially when you can think about with encryption, you can start thinking about who can have access and when. So it also enables the privacy, right? So it's one of those that applies to both.
What if regulations, let's say, I don't know much about the one that just passed in California. I'm assuming it applies not only to public companies, but government companies, but it also applies to private, or does it only apply to government institutions right now?
No, it doesn't apply to government. So
What?
No, so it applies to private companies that make, I think the cutoff is 25 million in revenue. And so this is one of the big pushbacks from, especially in the privacy community, is that when we're starting to push these regulations, any of these regulations must apply both to the government and to both to the public and private sector at the end of the day. And right now, they're really
only private, 25 million and higher.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then again, for the specifics, it has to be California residents.
Yeah.
And actually, in one of the areas where people get really confused, honestly, similar to some of the GDPR, is that you don't have to have your headquarters in California to have to comply to it. You just have to have data on California citizens in order that they have and above. And I don't remember what the cutoff is, but it's a certain number of records that you have to have above a certain level. And it's the same with GDPR. So American companies and companies around the world, anyone, has to adhere to GDPR if they're collecting data on European Union citizens.
Right.
Above a certain cutoff and so forth. And so that's where a lot of these compliance regimes actually start having a global reach, even though they start and only apply to certain citizens of certain geographic areas.
Yeah, and that's going to be painful for the states, because with 50 states and you're a company in Florida, now you have to comply with a law that was passed in California because you have information from someone from California.
Yep.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. If it's above a certain, again, it's above certain records. Sort of if you sort of check the box on all the ones who have to be regulated, then yeah. But you don't have to be headquartered in California. And I think that's something that gets missed a lot. And again, this is one of those things that, as more and more states do this, perhaps, I think Nebraska's one I just mentioned that. I think that was just this past week. Maybe they won't have that requirement. Maybe they'll have a slightly different requirement, right? Theirs will be, maybe you do have to have at least an office in Nebraska. Whereas, each one, there's so many different nuances for how they're going to be different that it's going to become so hard to comply with every single one. And I think that's good. If anything, honestly, I think that's going to be what pushes a federal law more than actual congressional competence in pushing through something right now. So, and then there's a lot of good advocates right now within the Congress. It just is such, just so divided right now. It's hard to get anything through, even if there is some bipartisan support.
Going back to the Equifax, and we spoke about this yesterday, that's a question that I really have. The CISO was fired. Her personal information, it was publicly accessible, but it's still personal information. She was put to the ringer with all that stuff. She was fired. I don't know if she was one of the executives that got a parachute. I have no idea. But most probably her career as a CISO is probably over, correct? And then it was found that this week or last week that China, state, perpetrated an attack. And we all know, doesn't matter who it is, you cannot defend yourself against a nation state attack. Does she have any legal ramifications out of this finding now? Because obviously then she was not at fault.
Well, so at this point, there could be some HR legal ramifications that none of us, at least I'm not privy to, so I don't know about any of that. I don't think it changes anything though, from her perspective. I think where it starts to change is if the laws start to come into play, where they get into the aspect of, different responses for nation state versus, say, a criminal act. But then it also gets into an area where, again, the U.S. is just very, very behind on this, and I think that's another big takeaway. We really have not progressed or innovated on data protection on the policy side and the legal side at all. We're very far behind. So on the one hand, actually, I think that that's somewhat good news, because that means that we can actually do a lot and learn from what other countries have done, and hopefully move forward with something that is beneficial and helps support innovation as well. But at the same time, it explains why we do have so many of these different breaches, because even in GDPR you have to have a baseline security, reasonable security measures that are in place.
Mm-hmm.
So had we had something like that, and had Equifax not had those reasonable security measures, however we decide to define them, then she still could be, she or he, whoever was at whatever the next big breach is, could be held accountable. But absent any of those kind of requirements, there's not an issue. The one issue where every state does have a law is on data breach notification. And so this actually gets, again,
that's a different story.
Which is a different story. So how long did it take for them to actually notify of an actual breach? And so, again, this is an area where the US is a complete patchwork. There actually are 54 different data breach notification laws, because you have all the 50 states, and then so you got DC, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. All of them have their own, all with different timelines. There are a couple that kind of negate each other as well. So it's a mess. I mean, and so that's where, again, where an executive could be held accountable if they didn't meet whatever state they are headquartered in, the requirement on that. So there's a couple of different angles where they could be held accountable. But right now, there isn't much accountability other than from board and from the broader population. There have been a couple proposals. There's one in 2018 from Wyden that actually was recommending jail time for executives who, and it was a two aspects. One that showed negligence, and then one also showed, I think, trying to mislead about what was going on or trying to cover up. And so,
all right, so I understand the last two. How do you show negligence? If you're a CISO and you do your gap analysis, your breach assess, everything, and you say, well, this is where I'm really risky and I need to spend $20 million to fix this, but then your board director shuts you down and now you get breached.
Yeah,
You didn't do anything wrong.
Right. No, so I mean, exactly. And so that's the one, it's not a law yet. and any of these have not gone past just being proposed. So he actually, he did another one last year. Elizabeth Warren actually did one last year as well, that both of those are the only two that I've come across that include any kind of executive jail time. Okay. And so for them though, keep in mind, they expand well beyond just the CISO. So it could be anyone, it could be anyone in the executive, and that also includes the chief privacy officer to the CEO.
C-level, everything, the board of directors. So, and I want to ask a stupid question because this is what it starts to, make me think about it. If government comes up with a law like that says negligence, that means that the government has to determine what not negligence means. Yep. Right. And that
absolutely.
And that means that they're going to have to start telling the companies, you need to have, this set of firewalls, this set of, are we going to that level where government will dictate what security in the organization is going to look like?
Well, so this gets back to the point of this is why the private sector has to get involved and help inform. Because on the one hand, and I hear arguments on both sides, and I'm personally a little bit divided on, because it would be nice if there were some baseline measures out there that you could use that everyone really should be following, but with a reasonable means to actually deploy them. And so that's where the private sector really needs to come in and say, we think encrypting X, Y, and Z, that's doable. We think multi-factor authentication is doable. We think the patch updating within an X amount of time may not be doable for these kinds of organizations. So where we can start getting into some more of the nuances of that, I think might be helpful, because what we're seeing, and this is what the interesting thing is, we're seeing just the recent studies on just after a year after GDPR, more companies are enacting more security measures for compliance for it. And so the compliance stick does work to help encourage greater security habits. And so I think that's a good thing. What we want to make sure though is that reasonable security measures are actually reasonable, and they're actually the ones that we want to be incentivizing companies to pursue. And so,
go ahead.
Yeah, because I was just going to say, because what we've seen for so long is that the data breaches themselves aren't incentivizing companies to enact greater security standards.
Right, because they've already done all the risk analysis, and they're like, well, we assume the risk.
Yep. And so that's where compliance is sort of working as the sort of doing the crowd mentality to try to immunize everyone. And so we'll see what happens. I mean, that's just a year into GDPR, but that's what some of the current findings are showing on that. And so again, I think that's a positive outcome. I know very much so as well that the amount of money companies are spending to get to that compliance level also is a lot. And so it'd be nice to also see perhaps some tax incentives for those who do comply and reach certain levels. And so and that's where we need to, that's where I'd love to see some more just broad discussion and some innovation in this area, because we talk a lot about tech innovation and we know that, but I think we understand fairly well how to secure data and what some of the best practices are. We haven't really understood both the human element for the humans' ability to work around it, but also what kind of incentives we can be providing both as technologists, but then also from the legal and the policy side to incentivize that kind of behavior, because we clearly have not done that yet.
But that brings a whole bunch of questions for incentives. What does that mean? Monetary, and who's going to end up paying that? Government, that means that all of us here are going to end up paying additional taxes to make sure that these companies to do the minimum that they need to do on a security basis. It also brings some questions. Then if I'm a lawyer, I could go back and say, wait a second. So if if this law passes and it says, hey, I need to meet this basic compliance, well, what happens to the Microsofts or the Oracles of the world that keep shipping software that is not 100% safe? And how do we then go back to them and tell them, hey, you should not be doing on Patch Tuesdays, 1,000 patches every Tuesday or every other Tuesday. If you go over that, you're going to be penalized. You see what I'm saying?
But I think those are two different issues. One is software development and supply chain, as far as the software supply chain. The other is how they're protecting their own organization. And so, but I do think both need to be addressed.
Well,
but I think those are two different areas that we require two different approaches.
If Equifax got breached because they didn't apply a patch that was a weakness on a operating system,
right?
Shouldn't then, in that regard, if that weakness wasn't there, I wouldn't have been hacked. So you go back to the originator and say, you didn't meet the minimum safety requirements that the government says to have a safe environment or a safe, item or whatever program out there. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I'm not an expert in privacy, but I don't know if it's opening Pandora's box that says, you're going to be penalized for not doing this. And then I'm like, yeah, but I have to do this because these multi-gazillion dollar companies are not doing the basics.
Yeah, but that's where I still think we need to find a way to address both, but through different angles. Because I think at the end, both are serious concerns. And I think the other thing you pointed out, that whatever software is not 100% secure, I think we're never going to get to, again, with humans building, and even if machines start doing all the code, there's still humans behind it that are helping guide them. So regardless, the human's not going to be out of the loop anytime soon. And so nothing is going to be 100% secure, and there's not going to be 100% privacy. And I think that when we only look at that as our only objective, as opposed to looking at it as a broader spectrum and how we can just improve and increase our security and privacy, that's where I honestly think that that's going to be one of the big mental blocks to a lot of folks in innovating on the tech and policy side, because if we can't get to that 100%, why even bother? And that's where that's why, assume breach, privacy, privacy is at all that, we're just all giving up right now because of that. But we've never had 100% of either one. But what we should aspire towards is getting as close to 100 as we can, 100% as we can, in achieving that. And so software will always have bugs. I mean, and until until some phenomenal innovation finds some way to not have that, which I don't see that happening anytime soon. We're gonna have to deal with that, but we should find ways to deal with that. That again, we can't have that squash innovation, and that's where so much of this has you get pushed back on from the tech community as far as, well, if we actually have to comply with that, then we're not gonna be able to innovate.
Right.
And I think that still is just such an outdated, mental model for how to look at it. Because actually, what we're starting to see, so it's interesting. Wired just had an article on Signal, who now is just got a bunch more money from the former WhatsApp exec, and to make it more accessible to the masses. And so, which is great, right? And so, privacy can actually help, and security can actually help spark innovation in new ways. And that's where we need to start thinking about that. When privacy becomes a competitive advantage, when it turns out that someone's going to buy software from X company versus software from Y company because X provides greater security and privacy of the data than Y does, that's where we're going to get the incentive. And again, that's where you get some of the incentives. It doesn't have to be incentives from the government, although I wouldn't rule out anything right now because we just haven't even looked at it. We should probably we should do the brainstorming and think about where they might, what might work best. But, economic benefits come, really have a big impact. And if it can be a competitive advantage, we're already starting to see that. And that's why, someone like Signal is going to try and become even more accessible to the masses, because they're already seeing what's going on with the concern over WhatsApp and that, and the pressure on Facebook to make WhatsApp not be, end-to-end encrypted. Signal's going to pop in and be like, well, look at us. We got it all.
Yeah, exactly. We're already there. Let's go back to the privacy topic. A couple of weeks ago, there was in Twitter, there was a big brouhaha about this company that does the background checks, right? But what they were doing is an AI that goes and scrapes everything that you've done on your, I think it was only Twitter for this case, I don't know. But the AI is there to highlight anything that you liked. If it has alcohol or anything religion and you liked it, it starts to say, create a report and say, no, this is bad because alcoholism. This is bad because of racism. How can a company have a business model based on that, which is their thing is like, well, this is public information, but you're doing a background check and determining the type of person that person is based on your privacy, your likes and stuff like that. I mean, is that going to take hold?
I think we're going to see more and more of it. I mean, we saw, Clearview AI also similarly scraped all the pictures for facial recognition detection. Yes. And so, again, until we see some sort of regulation or until we see the companies and alter some of the privacy settings on it, we are going to keep seeing that. And for many cases, some of those privacy options are already there, and many people just choose not to. Either they choose not to, or they're not aware that they even exist. Right? And I think for honestly the better part of the last 20 years, no one really even thought about. They just kind of assumed that data wasn't going to be widely available to everyone, right? And there was that assumption of security and privacy that everyone generally had until Cambridge Analytica, really. So it was like a lifetime ago, but it was just 2018. Right?
Imagine that. Yeah, because when you do a like before, when I did a like in Twitter, I always assumed it was just me. Nobody else can see it. And then I think at some time Twitter switched it, and now people can see what you liked. But it never dawned on me that it could be used in a negative way.
No, and that's where also, I mean, even if the different social platforms have addressed it in different ways, so many of them have had sort of that openness by default for a while. It's just that we as the consumers just didn't assume or didn't even think that would be in the realm of the possible for what someone may do with it. Exactly. And that's where you start seeing, and it's not even just from adversaries, right? It's the ad targeters, and that's where we see that a lot going on, especially with the election coming up, and what's allowed as far as the micro targeting of ads, because they went through, leveraged the AI to find out the last specific detail about you, and they target 10,000 people within a very small spectrum of what they're targeting. And so until it doesn't work, and until there isn't a market for someone to be using it, it will keep being. That's where, again, you have to go into whatever platform you have to decide what you want to be even putting online, right? But then also thinking about, once you put it on, go into your privacy settings, go into the security settings. I mean, I don't know if so I live in the DC area, and for the last year, Google had big billboards all over DCA, the national airport, with big signs on, easy privacy, security, here you go. A couple buttons here, there, and there. Use those. And so so as we see, more and more of these kind of articles coming out and news coming out about how our geolocation is being used, how our social media tracking is being used, all those kind of things, we need to go in, and if those options are available, you choose those. And that gets into sort of the access and use, right? Decide what you want, who can see your data, and who has access to it. At the same time, there's still those companies and their developers will probably still have access to that data.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody has that. Someone always has access to the data. It's just a question of how they use it. Yeah. Here's a question from Richard Sigrist again. Thank you, Richard. What are the cultural factors driving data protection regulation? In what ways is the United States ahead or behind of other countries in terms of the demand and willingness to regulate?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think we're very far behind. We don't even have any kind of data protection agency. Many other countries do have some sort of organization along those lines. Where we're seeing, and this is where it gets really interesting, for someone who's actually looking at the notion of democracy and authoritarianism, and starting to see some of the decline in some areas of democracy across the globe and the rise of digital authoritarianism, all this is linked together. And so in the areas of data protection where we're starting to see more laws and more innovation is actually among the authoritarian regimes. And that's why you're hearing these terms like digital authoritarianism, digital dictators are starting to pop up more and more, because they're looking at how they can craft policies that can support the regime, as far as controlling various kinds of narratives and having government mandated access to data. And so a lot of those kind of policies actually are under the umbrella of cybersecurity strategies and cybersecurity policies. And so what sounds on the surface like, oh, this is great. It's great. It's broad data protection for citizens and so forth. At the end of the day, enables government access to that data. And so they're doing a good job sort of creating that illusion of having some greater data protection when really it's requiring some sort of data access. On the democracy side, this is where GDPR, and I know some people, you either love it or hate it, is from what I can tell. It's done a really good job, at least starting to provide a democratic model, an alternative to that. So by focusing on individual data rights, individual data control, providing greater kinds of choice for the individuals and holding companies accountable for not protecting based on that baseline of standards, does go a long way towards helping secure and provide more of a free and open internet with the security to it. And the GDPR model actually is taking off a bit. And so Brazil later this summer will be implementing something very similar to the GDPR. When GDPR first came to effect, Japan elevated and adjusted some of their policies to be in sync with the GDPR. CCPA, while there's some differences, also was inspired by the GDPR in many ways. And so currently the GDPR really is the democratic model right now for data protection. And it's a good start. And this is where, again, there are plenty of lessons learned from that. There certainly haven't been enough resources to handle all the fines and all the potential violations that have been brought to them. And so there's some resourcing lessons learned that the United States could learn from that. But that's where the US just really hasn't done a whole lot. And if you look at, across cybersecurity writ large, the US still relies very much on the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act from the 80s as a key component. And you got the, Millennium Digital Copyright Act as well. And there are a couple others, but for the most part, it's really been a couple of decades since the US has innovated in these areas. And so that's where, on the one hand, it seems disconcerting, but it means that we haven't even tried to fight yet. It's kind of how I look at it. Like we need to get into the game now and really try and help shape a policy. And again, provide a broader model and framework for data protection and privacy and security that also helps sparks the innovation and the competitive advantage that can be gained by having protected data.
So if regulations come out, like GDPR, for example, comes out in the States, but you have products like Alexa or Siri or whatever, right? That even though they say we're not recording, they're listening. Yep. But by purchasing and turning it on by default, you're allowing them to do that. You just didn't read all that fine print. Which one takes precedence then in that case?
So I think that's gonna be up for individuals to decide for something along those lines. And that's where, again, it needs to be better privacy and much more, like the usable security and privacy, I think is just going to become more and more important. And so that people need to be able to both do it fairly easily, but also understand what they're doing. It can't be one of those things that's hidden within 20 different settings of your phone. And so it's going to depend. I mean, I know I have some friends who couldn't care less if the Alexa's recording everything. At the same time, like I refuse to have one in my house, which I think drives my family nuts. So, I think those are gonna be individual decisions, but so it's gonna be a combination, I think, of individual decision, but also corporate decisions for how they're making things and how they're going to be crafting it with the various kinds of controls. And that's, I imagine if, there was a new Alexa that came out that made it even easier and that was proven to not be capturing information 20 seconds before you turn it on or off, or any of those various kinds of stories that we've heard. If that's what starts to attract more consumers, then I think that will help incentivize yet again those IoT devices that have better security and privacy.
Yeah, with IoT, exactly. That's what we were talking with Cheryl before,
yep.
right? In that case, regulation will definitely help.
I think regulation will help, but I think it's regulation plus supply and demand. I think it's got to be some sort of like government top up, and then from the people below demanding those kind of things, and that's where we're seeing it. And I think that's where we hopefully will see a lot. There have been a couple of IoT bills, again, similar to the others that have been proposed, haven't gone anywhere.
Okay.
I think California actually passed one. I don't know if that came into effect or not, but
I thought that's part of the one that just came out.
Well, it's not part of the CCPA, but there's a separate one that was going through, and I think it got passed. That I can't remember though, so don't. Yeah, that one I'd have to look into. But IoT, I mean, that opens up a whole new area. Mm-hmm. Even when you think about like on privacy, on drone privacy, right? What?
Drones, yeah.
Is it allowed for my neighbor to have a drone in my window? Right? I mean, I would like to think it's not, but I don't currently think there are any rules to prevent them from doing that.
Wow, that's that opens up a whole different stuff. Time frame. When do you think we're going to see the first unified,
like an omnibus U.S. federal?
Yeah.
Okay. I would like to hope within the next 5 years.
Really? Okay.
So it's going to depend on the election and what the Congress makeup is going forward. In my opinion.
Assuming everything's going to stay the same, because it usually is, right? Historically, you never have the same party controlling everything, so it's going to be the same. And then in the next one, it's going to be the same. So personally, I see another 8 years or so unless something catastrophic happens.
Well, and that's I think the public momentum and what's going on at the state level is why I think it might be sooner than that. And that's why, because it really is just going to become so hard for companies to deal with all these different state legislation. I mean, I think it already is popping up to be a bit more of a challenge with CCPA than many thought, but that's just the first. And these other states are really going to start pushing through. And so I feel like that is going to be what might be a thing that forces it to happen sooner than, a decade from now.
Do you think other countries are waiting to see what the U.S. does to follow through? Because right now the U.S. is behind, right? Okay.
Nope. No, I think a year or two ago I would have said yes. I don't, not anymore. I mean, we've really withdrawn leadership in so many different areas that
really?
We sort of we've lost the ability to provide that kind of model currently, or for people to expect that model to be coming from us anytime soon.
Is it because of the type, and I want to say the age level that's in there? People are still, with that history in the background that, we need to see everything and, be there. And the new generation coming up, they won't have, they're more conscious of the privacy. So I'd say yes and no. I mean, there have been a lot of different interesting generational studies that show it's kind of a hodgepodge on, the younger generation is more willing to be putting a lot more information out versus the older generation, and the older generation maybe only focus on certain areas. I mean, so they're both better and worse at security and privacy by generation, I would guess. So I mean, there are issues with all of us at the end of the day and how we handle it. But I think that the broader issue globally was just, we've done so little in light of Cambridge Analytica, and I think that had we done more, which again is not a data breach, but it's a data compromise, and it's nebulous data sharing practices. And so that, again, the interesting thing actually we haven't brought up for the general populace, security and privacy are the same thing in their head. It's for those of us in the community where we really wanted to differentiate it. For them, it's like their data got out there. They don't care whether it's a privacy or security breach. Their data is gone, and someone that they didn't want to have it has it, and they're using it against them. Yeah. That's what they're concerned about. Yeah, and that was a question that I had before, and good thing that you reminded me. Yeah, it seems like only within a specific section that we are more focused on privacy. As you said, you have friends that could care less if Alexa listens to them. That seems to be the majority. So unless there's an awareness and a reason why it's important to protect your privacy, the tide is not going to change.
Yeah, well, I mean, but I think that, So I don't think they care about, which one it is, but I think the tide is changing, that they care that it happened.
Oh, okay.
So, and that they care, and that's where, again, we're seeing so many just public opinion poll, like one after another, just talking about more and more what you can do, both on your own device level, and what you can do as far as talking to your representatives to change these policies. And the public opinion is changing a lot. And I mean, so sort of like a sign I was looking yesterday, and MTV News, which I didn't even know was a thing anymore, because apparently it is. They had an article on how to maintain privacy while using dating apps.
Oh, wow.
So the fact that it's sort of hit that kind of public discourse, to me, is like that. Like that means it's hit prime time for popular discussion at this point. So whereas, again, like 5-6 years ago, I think any of us, if we ever told people we worked in security or privacy, it kind of was a conversation stopper. Now it's like someone will give you their device and it's like, set all my privacy settings right now for me.
Yeah,
so it actually is something that people ask about more and more. They want to know what they can be doing. And so that's where I think, again, we're going to see Congress pushed farther. But it's not going to, it's going to be at this confluence. It's going to be Congress getting pushed from the state legislatures, from the public. And then honestly, if things continue, there are going to be more breaches. I mean, that's and so and that's sort of the breaches have been sort of that steady drumbeat in the background. But we're also now having the data sharing scandals drumbeat continue.
Yeah,
Honestly, again, it seems like every week we find out that someone shared information in a way that we didn't know that they were doing it. So similar to like the facial recognition scraping, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as more and more of this just comes to light, people are going to still want to be pushed back on it. And then especially if it gets into areas like where it's being used even more so by HR and so forth, especially the AI driven. I mean, I'm sure you've seen that where they'll go through and look at the body responses and so forth to determine whether someone would be a good fit during an interview. Like, and so many of those are known to have false positives.
Oh yeah, of course. Because
So
it all depends on the AI and how well it has been fed information to learn from. So
and AI is only as good as the data that goes into it, right? And we know that data can be biased, and the people who are creating them, their biases can go into it as well. And so we have a long way to go. I think there's a lot of exciting work to be done in that area, and they're very similar though. I think a lot of these kind of tools also can be used to help protect us, and it's dual use in so many of these areas. And so we need to figure out how we can help promote the better use and the innovation of it to help preserve security and privacy, and what can be done to protect ourselves against the misuse of that data.
Going back to the legal aspects, if you found negligent, you're going to have jail time.
Yep.
Realistically, do you think that type of law will pass?
I don't. No, I think, I think it's one of those things. So it's interesting. So this is all part of what is becoming to be called the tech lash. So the backlash that we're seeing, at least in the United States and in some other places too, but largely in the United States, against big tech. And so, and while you'll say, Equifax and, Marriott and those, they aren't big tech, they're big corporations. And so, it's the tech lash, I think, is really pushing back on how technology is, and how those companies have not been protecting our own data. And so the jail time, that's sort of, honestly, that's like the first thing that ever happens in any kind of of these movements. Let's get the leaders, get them kicked out, and that's not going to solve the problem at the end of the day, because it's more of a broader culture that we need to have as a shift. But then also, like we talked about, if you do have China going after your data, say they do still apply every possible security measure, then it turns out it's an insider. An insider comes in who no one could have, who still passed every whatever checklist you need for seeming like a good employee. So there are just too many ways to circumvent some of the systems to hold them accountable to jail time. That said,
no, exactly, because you can show that you did everything that was required. It's just that they were able to do it within the check and balances that we have in place. That were still
right. Yeah, I mean, and that's where you've got that on one hand. However, I think the Equifax, one of their executives has had 4 months of jail for insider trading, because they were trading prior to the announcement of the breach. That's where you can see some jail time, and that makes sense. And that's where I can see, if some big corporation is hit, their execs know about it, decide to you know, you get rid of some stocks ahead or shares ahead of time and then announce the breach. You know, that seems like an insider trading issue that, you know, I think you could warrant jail time. But the other thing, as far as, you know, again, assuming that they were doing everything they possibly could do, I think that really is the wrong way to do it. And you already have, especially in the CISO's realm, where, you know, I think the average tenure is, you know, barely over 2 years, like 2.5 years. There's already so much stress and so much work that's being done to then penalize someone who's doing everything they possibly could to help keep the company safe. It just doesn't, it sends the wrong, message, but then it also is going to really hurt anyone wanting to, you know, go into those into that job. You know, it's going to make it a really, you know, unattractive job to so many people.
Yeah, personally, when I've been asked if I, you know, interested in a CISO position or something, I'm like, 500K minimum and a parachute of at least $1.5 million. Like, otherwise, forget it. Don't bother me, because I know I'll be there for 3 years, maybe 2, and my career will be over after that. So, yeah, no. Adrian Sonabria replied that the IoT law got passed last fall.
Okay.
No more default credentials allowed on IoT devices, and among some other less.
Yep.
So question about this one then. Does that mean it's only for IoT devices that are made in California or that are used in California? How the heck did a law like that apply?
I don't know. I'd have to go look into it. So I'm sure it details at least that part as far as what IoT devices are covered. I mean, because they actually, I mean, that has to be. So while most of these laws are pretty vague intentionally in certain areas, like defining what your personal data is, but for what the kind of device that actually applies to it, they should be pretty specific on it, as far as where it's made and so forth. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but I think that just highlights, if California does it and it starts being successful, other states are then going to have some other IoT policies as well, which just gets back to the need for, we need some, you know, sort of harmonization to go on at the federal level. Otherwise, it's going to make it extremely difficult to even know what to do. But actually, I mean, the interesting thing with that, you know, so similar to the GDPR, you know, some companies opted to apply those, you know, compliance to all data, not just European Union citizen data. And so I think that may be what we start seeing, is that, so instead of just saying, well, yeah, for California citizens, I need to do this, they're just going to apply that level across the board. And I think that will probably increasingly be the better solution to do, knowing just how what the variety is going to be, so that if you achieve compliance on some of the highest state level requirements, then ideally you are by default in compliance with the ones that aren't quite as strict.
Okay.
That might have to be the game plan for a while.
Okay. And then the last couple of minutes, what do you think? Is privacy then up to each individual to control how much you want to? Should we expect help from government to identify what is privacy and what is not, and how to use it and not use it? Yeah,
so this is where, again, I think it's a shared responsibility. I do think individuals do have some responsibility for it, but I would not ever assume that it should be 100% on individuals. Again, partly because we don't always know what's going on with the data, or it's just made so difficult for the average user to not know how to figure out how to do it. And so that the individual takes some responsibility, and ideally can be made easier, but it does, I think, both on the corporations and the corporate responsibility, but then also on the government. I mean, I think it has to be a team effort as we move ahead, because again, this ensuring data protection and privacy and security both fall under the umbrella of data protection for me. Ensuring that is so, you know, it's just going to be essential for us as a democracy going forward. It's essential for protecting our IP. It's essential for protecting our PII. It's essential for helping ensure we can innovate in various ways and really leverage a lot of the technologies that are going on, from 5G, from IoT, from AI. Like, all that privacy and security has to be part of any of those discussions these days. And it's not quite yet. Like, if you look at this, if you watch the CES, you know, some of the hot takes on the CES Consumer Electronics Show a little while ago, security and privacy were barely mentioned. So there was one big panel with like Facebook and Apple, and that, you know, talked about privacy, but then the rest of the time they're like, we'll have this panel that talks about it, but the rest of it, but here are all these other IoT devices that are now sucking up all your data and doing, you know, God knows what with it.
Yeah, so, exactly.
So we're not quite there yet, but that's, I think that's where I, you know, it's not on, you know, it's not an easy solution. This stuff is hard, and which is why, you one, it's a fascinating area to be in, but it's also why there's so much more work to be done, that we need to innovate on the government side, the corporate side, and there's individuals have to become more aware of how to do it. And it was actually one good way to think about this. Actually, I like this again from the Wired article that on Signal, that the CEO basically was on the airplane, sat next to a guy who literally said, can you show me how to put airplane mode on? But the guy had the Signal app on his phone. And so the takeaway really was like we need to be able to make security and privacy easy for people who can't, airplane mode, it's a button, you can push it on and off, but those are the kind of things, like if it's not intuitive to someone, right, it's not going to get done. And so we need to make it so that privacy and security are intuitive and you can figure out how to evolve and how to make it accessible for everyone. And I think that's where corporations can innovate on that side, especially in the big tech. But that's where also the government can help provide various kinds of compliance and incentives for that to happen. And then individuals, I think, are just increasingly more and more really becoming much more aware of those kind of things. And even if you look at the discussion about TikTok, these kind of discussions weren't going on a little while ago. And partly it's because it's one of the first big non-US social media platforms. But I think it really is sparking conversation. I think there have been some lessons learned as far as, well, Facebook's doing this, let's just say TikTok's on. TikTok could be going straight to the Chinese government.
Exactly.
So we're having new conversations that we wouldn't have been having a couple of years ago, which I think is highlighting just the elevation of these conversations.
The awareness is being accepted. All right, last question from Richard Sigrist. Do you think privacy regulation has a chance against the demand for consumer products and applications that are supported through surveillance capitalism? I think you just answered with the example from CES. Yeah, it's like the answer is probably not, because people were more interested in the, what the application can do for me, and less what information is gathering.
It is, and again, I think the surveillance capitalism, that aspect, I think again it's so interesting. You look at like London is one of the most highly surveilled cities in the world, but there aren't quite as many concerns about that, just given the state of their government on how it'll be abused, because there are in theory enough checks and balances within the government to at least limit the kind of abuse that you may see what goes on in an authoritarian regime. And so there are ways that again, all these things are going to be dual use, where you can see, like in this example I always use, like when I was in London, out taking a taxi cab to somewhere where I had no idea where I was going, I was glad to see that there was a camera in there. Like for me as a single woman in there, like I'm like, okay, it's a little bit of protection for me, perhaps, right? Whereas, I other people may not like that, but I like that made me feel more secure by having that camera in there. So I think different groups are going to have different perspectives on different areas of it, and that's where again where the makeup of the government comes into play. Where in democracies, in theory, we're going to have the checks and balances to support that, and that's where we have to push to make sure, as a tech community, to ensure what that proper balance might be to enable people to leverage the security and privacy from some capabilities and limiting the kind of abuse that could happen from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last statement from Richard Sigrist, and I think this is a statement. Are people willing to truly be private versus narcissism? Well, that's it. That's the statement. That's exactly what
that's awesome. But again, but that's an area where I think that's where people can decide, right? And that's where privacy is. Some people may choose to have more of the information out there, and that if that's what they want, that's what they want. And those of us who may not want as much information, we don't have to. And that's where again, privacy it's along a spectrum. And you do what you feel is right for you, but you need to have those opportunities and have the knowledge to make those decisions. And before that, no one really, the awareness wasn't there, and the ability to alter those decisions wasn't there. And I think both of those is changing.
Exactly. It's almost like a rose. What was it saying? The rose by any other name? Yeah. So over here, or beauties. No, but mostly it's beauties in the eye of the beholder. Privacy.
There you go. So privacy is in the eye of the beholder. Yep.
That's better. Well, Andrea, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time here. Wow, a lot of information. A lot of it went over my head.
Nah.
But I was able to stay there a little bit, and I think a lot of us were able to hold on. So really appreciate your time being here.
No, thanks so much. Those were great questions. I appreciate that. And thanks for everyone for tuning in.
All right. So.